Thank you. I hope everybody gets comfortable here. You can move around. There will not be a potty break. I just want to let you know. But if you need to leave the room, that's just fine too. Thank you, Robbie, for the kind introduction, and Becky for setting up this program for us. You're essential to the Explorers Club in St. Louis. Thank you. Welcome, friends and fellow explorers. Thank you for coming to join us on this high-speed voyage through 7 years in British Columbia and Alaska aboard our little boat, Jupiter. We have some special guests here tonight that I'd like to welcome. Connie and Dan Burkhardt, who always tell us to go where it doesn't make sense. And Katie and Charlie Claggett, who have, through some miracle of maritime voyaging, survived voyages aboard Jupiter on both coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific. Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about our adventures. Fiona and I have 25 years of experience on live-aboard yachts on the Atlantic seaboard from the Bahamas to Nova Scotia and all the Great Lakes, and now the Pacific from Puget Sound to British Columbia and Alaska. We have been members of the Explorers Club for 30 years since we used to meet at Schneidhorst, if you can remember that. Originally as balloonists, but now we're mariners. We both carry U.S. Coast Guard 100-ton master's credentials and are quite active in the Coast Guard Auxiliary in Key Largo, Florida.
Because there are only two of us on board most of the time, it's very important to us to be cross-trained on all the systems. Each of us strives to understand and can operate and service most of the systems aboard. One might be better than the other at certain things. Randy, for example, is really good at changing filters, and I'm probably better at crawling behind the engines, and I'm definitely better at the laundry. When we need to troubleshoot, however, we problem solve together. Our boat is a Grand Banks Aleutian Pilothouse motor yacht. She is 53 feet on the water and 60 feet in length overall, and she weighs in at a hefty 80,000 pounds. She is a tough little boat. We commissioned her in 2011. She was a production boat to which we made many changes to make her suit our cruising needs. We had a previous Grand Banks for 10 years before her, and so we had very strong opinions on the kind of setup that we wanted in this boat. After 16 years on the East Coast in this boat and the previous one, we were ready for some new adventures.
So we asked ourselves, where would Jupiter be at her best? And the answer was obvious, the Pacific Northwest. It's horrible to see your little boat hanging like this aside a rusty freighter. And Jupiter was aboard that boat in 2018 as deck cargo with 30 other vessels from Fort Lauderdale to Victoria, BC, over 40 days. She arrived dirty, but fully functional, and the engines started right up.
So this is what it looks like at the primary helm. We have a secondary helm up on the flybridge that we can use in good weather. It's very complicated, and I'd like you to pay attention to these slides because there will be a quiz at the end of the evening. From here, we control boat systems and house systems, although almost everything that I labeled on these slides is related to navigation and boat operations, except, of course, for the microgreens. You might see those down in the corner here, very important. And essentially, we have all the systems that come on a big ship sized down for our little boat. I'd like to welcome you to the engine room. Many of the systems that facilitate our mission and keep us comfortable are here in the beating heart of the ship. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Twin Caterpillar engines with equivalent force to more than 1,400 horse. V-drive shafts connect gears to propellers with 4 bronze blades on each of these impellers. There are rudders that turn us to starboard or port, governed by an autopilot for steering support. A lithium-ion battery bank charged underway by the engine's crank. Generators, alternators, inverters, all humming. Fuses and switches and solar power coming. A desalinator fills a freshwater tank. Superpower showers save us from smelling rank. Water heated and metered so we never feel depleted. A washer and dryer tumble away every day, clean and clothes and Towels clean and dry, put away. Forced air heat and air conditioning, Garmin GPS for accurate positioning. Wi-Fi beams in through Musk's Starlink, no dishwasher, but a husband and a kitchen sink. Fridges and freezers, a convection roaster, a blender, 4 burners, Nespresso and toaster, a wine fridge and barbecue grill on the flybridge. Sonars and radars to give us a feel for what's above and below, what's imagined and real. Radios at every helm in hand, some VHF, some single sideband. For announcing our presence or hailing friends, to check in with a captain or learn weather trends. Heads that flush fast or flush slow, television and stereo, searchlights, running lights, and anchor lights that glow, davits and winches, straps and cinches, antennas galore, life rafts and life jackets, throwables, and a ditch bag for 4. Boatboarding stairs, strobes and flares, vacuum systems and pumps in pairs, fire suppression in case of inflammatory indiscretion, throttles and bottles of fluids and oils, fenders, cleats, and lines and coils. Defibrillator, fender inflator, medical kits, spare part bits, splints to immobilizer, a gyroscopic stabilizer, toolkits, woolen mitts, foul weather suits, and various boots, watch caps, crab traps, fish scraps, charts and maps, washdown pump, bilge pumps, and gray water auto sumps, horns that warn and bells that tell in the fog of wildfire smog, vents and venturis that direct the air, dryers for clothes and for hair, kayaks with paddles, power cables, kitchen ladles, tide tables, vacuum cleaner, wet dry vacs, boat hooks, mops, and backpacks. Fishing rod seems odd, shoebox, ship's clocks, tackle and blocks. It seems like a lot, but it's what we've got, and without it, we'd be in a spot.
It's a very simple boat, actually. So I'd like to know how many of you have cruised the Pacific Northwest, whether it's been on a cruise ship, large or small, maybe a private yacht or your own kayaks. Will you raise your hand if you've been there? Well, it's a lot of people, and it's a very popular place. You know then how spectacular this part of the world is. It's an immense area, 850 nautical miles from Seattle to Glacier Bay. To put that in perspective, it's the same distance as Jacksonville, Florida to Boston. I think the distance is about twice that if you went along the inside and outside passages. And I'd like to point out on this map chart here that Vancouver Island, which is off the coast of British Columbia, and Haida Gwaii, again, off the coast of British Columbia. And of course, Glacier Bay is the top of our range at almost 60 degrees of latitude. Along this route, there are 5 barriers to navigation, traditionally called gates. Each of the 5 gates typically intimidates about 50% of approaching pleasure boats. Therefore, if 100 hypothetical boats departed Seattle to head northwest, only 3 of those boats would eventually arrive in Alaska, and here's why. The first gate is the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It's a difficult passage across a body of water that lies between Washington State and the southern coast of Vancouver Island. It's a major shipping route, rough seas, contrary winds and tides that deter 50% of our Seattle 100 mariners. Next, we have the Georgia Strait. It's an immense body of water, kind of like a little Great Lake. It's susceptible to wind against tide, which increases wave height. Now we are in Canada with a wet passport and seasick. Only 25 mariners are moving northwest. The third gate is the tidal rapids of the Johnstone Strait and the Discovery Islands. This is an area of cataracts and very narrow channels. It's my favorite place where you need to strategize your passage to time it through a series of rapids that are only passable for a few minutes 4 times a day. This further culls the fleet another 50%, now yielding 12 boats moving onward. Cape Caution is the 4th gate, the first open water passage exposed to the Pacific. River outflows against incoming tides, waves from Japan building on the continental shelf. North of here is a long wilderness of narrow channels and deep fjords with few towns and fewer resources. A mariner will definitely be anchoring here many times, and only 6 boats proceed. The 5th and final gate is the Dixon entrance. This is another challenging open water crossing. Insistent waves and tides, winds conspire to keep you in Canada. The gateway to Southeast Alaska is fiercely guarded by Dixon entrance. Our original 100 boats, only 3 now have opted to continue to Southeast Alaska, the Great Land.
So you've heard about the 5 gates, and now I'd like to share with you a little bit about 5 or 6 of our favorite feathered friends. We never imagined how many birds there would be and what a significant role they would come to play. We love to watch them, and we spend hours doing so, and particularly like to see them change their plumage, or I like to say change their costume with the seasons. On the left, you have cormorants roosting on a navigational buoy, and these green cans can hold up to 12 family groupings. And the top of the can serves as a communal wing drying rack. You've all seen the cormorants with their wings out. They get up there all together. And then on the right, we have aptly named turnstones. These are a migratory flocking bird. They often travel south with us in the fall. And they're aptly named because they actually do land en masse on a small rocky outcropping or island, and using their beaks, they turn every stone to find the insects, mollusks, and crustaceans that they love to eat. And then when they've denuded that island completely, they move on en masse, leaving no stone unturned. This is a pigeon guillemot, a perennial favorite with his bright red socks. They are great characters, a lot of fun to watch, and they're very difficult to photograph. I'll be up there on the bow with my long lens, and as soon as we come into camera range, they dive. This is what it looks like when they run up to take off, and you can see that this little fellow actually has a small fish in his mouth. Raven is rampant, not only in the air, but in native myth and lore. To the native people, he is known to be a trickster and a shapeshifter, and they call upon him to clarify vision or thought. These birds can also change their voice in incredible ways and lead you on away perhaps from a nest or something that they don't want you to be around by imitating many other creatures. Ravens' stories in native myth are usually tell of how the world came to be. This is, of course, a great blue heron, my favorite bird. They are such patient hunters, spending 90% of their waking hours stalking prey, and I would like to learn patience from them. And of course, the bald eagle. These are so prevalent here that we call them rats of the sky. They're scavengers and therefore very effective cleaners of the shoreline. Anybody who's spent much time in Southeast Alaska will have noticed that there are no small dogs left.
I'd like to talk a little bit about navigation. Marine navigation in this area is challenging in one regard, but an absolute joy. There are bewildering choices of routes and destinations to be made every day. And when we are navigating, we are following a dream to find places and experiences that we never dreamed possible. Successful and safe navigation begins with preparation, consulting resources, and there are many here. We plan routes, check the weather, and check the tides. And underway, we strive to maintain a good watch and situational awareness. And of course, at the end of every passage, we need to find a beautiful and secure anchorage to spend the night.
The alternative to careful navigation is disaster. We have these aids to navigation like the green can here, and where they exist, they're generally reliable. Some areas are well documented in books and also well marked, but we are often tempted to go off-piste into areas that are less well written about and less well explored. Lucky Star here got unlucky on this occasion. This is a well-known local fishing boat, and this experienced fisherman went aground in the Peril Strait in the night in fog. We left at first light from our anchorage and passed him early in the morning. We offered assistance by radio, but he had help on the way. And I heard a couple of weeks later from one of the dock masters that he was floated at high tide with very little damage. However, this is nobody's idea of a fun night. No mariner in the Pacific Northwest would ever disregard the phase of the moon on tides and currents. Full and new moons result in considerably greater tidal ranges. In this area, we have semi-diurnal tides, meaning there are 2 high and 2 low tides in a 24-hour period. The moon controls tides. Higher tides beget stronger currents, and that affects sea conditions. Tides magnify or moderate winds, and the tidal range here is between 9 and 30 feet. The range of tide is related to geography rather than latitude. We have never been in any part of the world where the moon has had such a significant effect on our lives. This picture is taken in a place called No Name Cove, and you'll see a big floating berg in the foreground from nearby Sawyer Glacier. On the night that we were anchored there, we were not in sight of the glacier, but it calved during the night with a bone-shaking boom.
The importance of timing tides and currents cannot be overstated. To navigate through the Gillard Passage, and I've shown a current table for that passage here, we need to find safe water at a slack tide, which on this date shown is at 0420 in the morning or 10:10 hours. And we have about 20 minutes to make the transit. I think Charlie and Katie were with us when we made that passage. Nearby to the Gillard Passage is the Devil's Hole. It's a whirlpool, and it has been known to swallow boats whole. A fishing vessel in the 1980s was sucked into the whirlpool with 2 fishermen aboard, and neither the boat nor the men were ever found. The surrounding water is 500 to 800 feet deep. We'll talk a little bit about our environment. From spring through fall, April through October, the ambient temperature varies little between 45 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And we have winds from the northwest or southeast influenced by low pressures, and their speed is also influenced by the terrain. Seawater temperature varies little between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's quite cold. And the precipitation is extremely frequent. Weather forecasting in the Pacific Northwest seems to be much more accurate than on the Atlantic coast. And this may be because we have very little convective activity, thunderstorms, and they are very rare.
Rain is a feature of life afloat in the Pacific Northwest. The further north you go, the more it rains. This is temperate rainforest, so rain is not only expected but required. And what do we do about the rain? Well, there's nothing we can do to stop it falling, so we dress appropriately and we go out in it. If we didn't, we would never go ashore, we would never get to explore. This past summer, to give you an example, we had 6 straight weeks of rain, morning, noon, and night, never stopped, and that is actually normal for this area. The last 2 summers, we've been pretty lucky with the weather, but this year we saw a return to more normal conditions. There are many types of adverse conditions, but fog is certainly the most pernicious of them. When we're traveling in fog, we rely on our instrumentation, especially radar, and our automatic identification system, or AIS. Also, careful watchkeeping and good navigation are called for. The fog layer can be quite thin, allowing sight of the sun above, but it can be entirely opaque at eye level to the extent that sometimes we cannot see the bow of the boat. AIS, automatic identification system, allows other vessels to see us as an electronic signature on their charts and allows us to see them if they have AIS and if they have it turned on. Some of the fishermen like to sneak around and not let anybody else know where they're fishing, so that complicates things somewhat. I will also say there is a certain element of luck to traveling in thick fog in this area.
How about skill, huh?
Yeah, that too.
Anchorages are normally quite calm in the evening and throughout the night. The water is a mirror that reflects the shore as shown here. We often wonder if this is where the native peoples got the idea for totem poles. Turn the shore on end. However, we occasionally also experience willy-waws in the late afternoon if surrounded by steep terrain or glaciers. A willy-waw is a sudden cold downslope wind, a katabatic wind traveling down a mountain to the sea. Willy-waws can last a few minutes or much longer and are quite violent. But generally, there is a return later to nocturnal calm conditions. Another common hazard is logs in the water, particularly in BC where logging is very active. Tide lines occur where currents meet, and debris with dead heads, trees, and lumber congregates along these lines. We slow Jupiter or coaster through these hazards. If you see birds appearing to stand on the water, they are standing on logs pretending to be the Canadian Navy.
Remarkable rock formations surround us everywhere we turn. Our geology book is well thumbed. Water is constantly moving in interesting ways, both off the land and in the sea, and ice, still prevalent, has a profound effect. Let's consider each of these in a little more detail. These pictures are taken in Tracy Arm, which John Muir described as a wild, unfinished Yosemite. It's a 25-mile-long fjord headed by two glaciers, North and South Sawyer. It is full of hanging valleys, pristine waterfalls, granite cliffs that rise from sea level to 4,000 feet. The water you can see here is colored by glacial sediment. We would not use our water maker here, it would ruin the membranes. And riding up Tracy Arm reminds me always of my middle school geography lessons, because everything that we ever learned about is there on display beautifully in Tracy Arm. As well as thousands of islands off the coast, there are many of these great fjords that cut deep into the continental landmass. The longest is the Lynn Canal at 90 miles. It's a naturally occurring fjord, and we explored it in detail last summer. These fjords tend to generate their own weather, particularly wind.
Lacey Falls is located up a steep fjord in British Columbia. It is 100 feet deep right up to the beautiful waterfall, deep enough that you can put your bow in the waterfall and wash it off. Boats sometimes come to fill their tanks here by placing a collection pipe under the float. Chatterbox Falls in Princess Louisa Inlet is guarded by difficult tidal rapid. When we were here one winter, the tidal calculations were thrown off by 30 minutes because of the immense amount of fresh water from this waterfall and many others flowing into the basin. Fresh water floats on salt water and is the first to freeze. LeConte Glacier calves often to create large and small bergs. Most of the ice is below the water, and the larger bergs are quite dangerous because they can overturn without warning. Navigation through ice like this is extremely hazardous to your boat. Ice is as hard as iron and can disable running gear and hole your hull. We sometimes collect a piece of ice for our drinks. It is beautifully clear, having been under pressure for thousands of years.
And we love to see ice as art. As you can see here, it's formed into beautiful shapes by wind and water. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Glacier Bay at the north end of our cruising range. The First Nation Tlingit people have called this their homeland for thousands of years. Their lore tells of residents prior to the most recent ice age. And they say that when the ice came in, it came down from the glaciers into the bay at the speed of a running dog. Imagine that. Here's what we know. In 1750, 100 years before the end of the Little Ice Age, there was no Glacier Bay. The glacier had reached its maximum, overwhelming the Tlingit homeland. By 1795, the glacier was in recession and 5 miles of the bay was exposed. By 1879, when John Muir visited, the glacier had retreated 40 miles back into the bay, and by 1916, it had retreated 65 miles and sat much as it sits today. I'd also like to explain a little bit about a phenomenon called isostatic rebound that's very prevalent in this area, and I've been practicing this with my two hands, so I'm going to try to do it with one hand. So what happens is the Earth's crust is floating on the magma layer below, and when the glaciers are on top of the crust, it's weighed down into lower into the magma. When the glaciers retreat, the crust lifts, which causes land level rise and sea level fall. That is very prevalent here, and it's not what's happening in Florida.
Seals calve on glacial flows in the spring, where their pups are protected from most predators. This pup we photographed is a newborn, just moments old. And on this day in June, we saw dozens of these maternal scenes.
Do not go overboard. We do occasionally get into the water on purpose, and this summer we practiced cold plunging. However, One of the greatest risks for two people traveling alone is to have one person fall overboard, and our first rule is not to do so. It can be useful to think of the 1-10-1 rule, although conditions and responses most definitely vary. That rule states that you have 1 minute to get control of your breathing and to resist panic setting in. You have 10 minutes to formulate a plan, and you have 1 hour to survive before hypothermia and possible death. The first of these, 1 minute to get control of your breathing, is why we practiced cold plunging this summer. We carry personal locator beacons and automatic identification beacons combined in one package inside our PFDs, and we'd be very happy to explain those later to anyone who's interested. Essentially, if our PFDs inflate, in case of an emergency, a signal will be sent to the satellite, and it's like calling 911 to the sky. You will highly likely be rescued. If I set it off now, they'd probably come running in the door.
Anchoring is extremely important for us. Of the 143 days that Fiona and I spent aboard Jupiter this last summer, about 100 nights were spent on anchor. You learn to trust your choice of anchorage, your ground tackle, and your partner. We carry an 80-pound ultra anchor and 400 feet of 1/2 inch chain, plus a lighter redundant setup. We use powerful electric windlass to manage the gear, but if necessary, our heavy chain can be ratcheted up 1 foot at a time, and we have done this twice over the last couple of years without the benefit of a chiropractor.
Why do we enjoy anchoring so much? Well, certainly it allows you to go to the most remote places you can imagine. It's very tranquil. We see a lot of wildlife. And of course, we're always careful to anchor off the shipping lanes. We're very often alone in these anchorages, sometimes for several days at a time. It's very easy to set up for the night and to depart in the morning. And perhaps my favorite reason is because, as you can see in this picture, it makes you feel very small. And I think it's good for all of us to feel small once in a while. Swinging on the hook, as we call it, is our absolute favorite place to be.
This is a photograph of our chart plotter when we were going into a particular anchorage that we found to be quite beautiful. You can see the symbol for our boat is this little boat on the little icon. And we have a predictor line. It's this black line. And it tells us, if we stay on this same course, where we will be in 2 minutes. It's quite very handy. We're going through these 2 sea mounts. I think a prudent mariner would probably go elsewhere, go around to the left, and then go into the anchorage. But Fiona likes the tight, challenging, narrow, shallow approaches to anchorages. One of the problems we have in finding these anchorages is we're looking for a convenient depth. For our boat, it's 30 to 100 feet. And we find that the soundings marked on the chart are extremely inaccurate, particularly in Southeast Alaska. And we joke that they were last surveyed by George Vancouver in 1794. We're also looking for easy access to an anchorage, protection from wind and waves, and a seabed with good holding in mud. Getting ashore can be accomplished from Jupiter with our inflatable tender or kayaks. We lower these boats with our hydraulic davit, and because we have large tides, we need to beach our tender at low tide so it will still be floating when we choose to leave, because we can't carry that boat on the rocks. We use a long painter of 150 feet, which we tie the tender to a rock or a tree above high tide line. Kayaks are much more flexible because we can beach at any tide and carry the boats up the shore. Kayaking is also the best way to explore nearby islands and shores and to approach wildlife.
And wildlife there is. Going ashore in Southeast Alaska, bears are a great and ever-present danger, especially brown bears or any bear with cubs. Ideally, one would be armed with a large bore pump-action shotgun loaded with slugs. However, we don't carry a weapon because of restrictions on transiting with one through Canada. The brown bear seen here was on Admiralty Island, Alaska, and had 2 teenage cubs in tow that I think she was trying to ditch. And this summer, we were out in the small tender, and this black bear appeared swimming alongside the tender. We stopped the tender, of course, and watched him muscle himself ashore up an impossibly steep, rocky slope. We go ashore in wild places to explore either the natural world or what man has left behind. Here we're shore combing on the west side of Vancouver Island with fabulously interesting and very healthy tide pools in an area that has a particularly large tidal range. The ports here are generally not connected to each other by land or by road. That makes them accessible only by boat or seaplane. And the result of that is that it gives each of these communities a very distinct personality, typically based on the people who first settled it. Here we are at Back Eddy Resort in British Columbia. We arrived here early one spring, pre-season, and they had just survived a vicious winter storm that had separated the dock. So we asked if there was a place that we could tie up, and they said absolutely, as long as we didn't mind tying the stern of Jupiter to the part of the dock that was still fixed and the bow to the part that had come adrift so that they could effect repairs while we were stapling them together.
We often enjoy going into ports so that we can socialize with other mariners and with the locals. We are sometimes constrained by slip size or access, as here in Comox, BC. In January, when we were here, the fishing fleet was laid up for the winter and there was only one available spot. And I'm not sure how we got in there or how we got out of there. It was tight. It's exciting to tie up in remote communities. We are not too big to land at small floats. And if we're lucky enough to find dock space, we become a feature of great interest. It is often said if you arrive at an unknown place by land, you're a tourist. But when you arrive by boat, you're immediately part of the scene. In the window photo, we are at Kasan, a tiny Haida village. And in the larger photo, we are in Port Protection, Alaska, village of the outcasts. Has anybody seen Port Protection, the National Geographic 8-season reality TV show? We hadn't either. But I tell you, it is a very strange show, and the place is even more strange.
Everywhere we land, we find surprising people doing surprising things. This is a very enterprising young couple in remote Pelican, Alaska. They had removed the engine and the guts from a boat that was no longer working and installed every conceivable type of coffee and espresso making device and milk frothers. And on this particular morning, and I suspect every other morning, they were doing a roaring trade in hot chocolate and lattes right in the heart of the marina.
Cruise ships, of course, dominate the shoreline of large ports like Ketchikan, Juneau, and Sitka in Alaska. Ketchikan now allows 7 immense ships daily, and the population of Ketchikan quadruples from morning until late afternoon. Cruise ships also visit smaller ports like Hoonah, Alaska, with very little to offer other than the advertised promise of a native village. The appetite for cruising and for cruising destination is growing, and many of the smaller settlements are ill-equipped to meet expectations. We, of course, need to visit these towns and cities to provision, to refuel, to change passengers, or to find someone to make a repair. We do not stay very long.
We do love to explore abandoned places, and there are plenty of them. This area used to be richly inhabited, but is no longer due to the reduction of extraction industries. Some favorites. This is Namu Cannery in British Columbia. It was thriving from 1893 until 1970. It's on the land of the Heiltsuk people, and the name in their language means place of high winds. It boasted a population of 400 people and a school. And I can tell you that many First Nations and Asian immigrants were among those hired to work the canneries up and down this coast. And many of the Asians have stayed in the area. And of course, also the First Nation people. Much of the coastal land in BC is now being returned to the control of the First Nations bands that called them home and never ceded them in the first place. This is beautiful Buttedale. It was a fishing, mining, and logging camp and cannery, and it was in its heyday from 1911 through 1970. Somebody recently bought this property and installed a new dock, which allowed us to tie up for the night and explore this lonely, fantastic place. It's there because there's a powerful waterfall nearby that provided all the hydropower necessary for the industry during its heyday.
Here is Lake Bay on Prince of Wales Island. It's a very curious place. We didn't intend to go here, but the winds were so strong out in the channel that we had to find a place to hole up. We anchored in a small cove and found nearby this old cabin and a beautiful maple tree, probably planted by some forgotten homesteader. The rainforest quickly subsumes whatever man leaves behind, and it's remarkable for us that we can still find a little bit of hidden history. This is what was known about the Pacific Northwest in the early age of exploration. And these explorers came here to claim lands for empires, to find what riches they might be, and to seek the Northwest Passage. Vitus Bering, in the top left, had many geographical features and bodies of water named for him. He was a Dane in the employ of the Tsar. He represents an important distinction between explorer and mariner. Bering was much more concerned about the safety of his ship than about meeting the goals of exploration with which he was charged. And he never lost his bearings. First documented contact with native people was in 1774 by the Spanish at Nootka Sound, and here we are anchored up in Nootka Sound. Many, many years later, it's a beautiful spot. The First Nations and residents at the time of first contact lived in sophisticated, stratified societies, often matrilineal, with distinctive cultural identities. They are considered to have been some of the wealthiest people on earth in terms of natural resources at the time. There were many different bands, many languages, and many conflicts between them. Because they had such abundant food, they had sufficient leisure to produce beautiful art and crafts.
These explorers came for the land rights and to plant their flags, but this is what they found and harvested to near extinction. This is a cute little sea otter. They have the densest fur of any creature on Earth at 1 million hairs per square inch, and they live their entire life in the water. The Spanish, then the Russians, and the English and the Americans did their part to destroy these populations in the name of trade. Now they're protected and they're making a good comeback. Even in the 7 years that we have been cruising here, we've seen remarkable growth in their numbers and their spread, to the extent that they're becoming a little annoying to the fishermen. If we see sea otters, we don't bother to fish or crab because, as we like to say, otters eat first, and they are voracious. First Nation artisans are also making a big comeback. Throughout our cruising range, there's a resurgent interest in many of the native art forms and in teaching them to the younger generations. We know these people, of course, best for their totem poles, but they also make beautiful decorative blankets, woven baskets, conical hats, bentwood boxes, fabrics made from cedar, and of course their canoes. Totem poles are full of meaning, and contrary to our imagining of low man on the totem pole, the bottom figure is marked with special respect and honored for his strength because he holds up all the others. The totem pole also gives details like lineage and how many potlatches the owner has held in his lifetime to share his wealth. Art as part of residences is a matter of great pride to these people, and I would include in this category funereal boxes that were made to hold the remains of chiefs and set atop poles, and decorative longhouse portals. You could read the portals much as we read a mailbox number today to know which extended family lived within. Here's an example of an old portal in Mimquamlis, British Columbia, home of the Mamalilakula First Nation, and the one on the right is about 3 years old, and it is in Juneau, the capital of Alaska. This type of art is called form line art. The First Nations historically and today, their land bridges British Columbia and Alaska, and they're understandably reluctant to recognize international or other man-made boundaries that have been imposed upon them. The pain and stain of contact is still felt today, and Andy here on the right with us is a watchman at a ruined village site. He and his brother were forcibly taken to a boarding school where his culture was shamed and erased. He convinced us that he had gone on to live a happy life, but he also told us that his mother never recovered and died of a broken heart. Some of these tribes suffered population loss of up to 90% as a result of contact and Western diseases that resulted. Therefore, today there is lots of intermarriage between bands and between Native and white people, to the extent that it's hard to distinguish people as First Nation by their looks. In fact, we were asked in one of the Haida band offices if we were Haida. The 4th of July couple here at the top left were in Hoona, a Native community near Glacier Bay, and Mike in the turquoise shirt in the bottom picture is the tribal chief in the village of Kassan. And while he was proudly showing us their totem pole park, some cousins from California came down the trail and recited their lineage by way of introduction. Lineage is very important to First Nations people. But Mike was already taking them very seriously because their conical hats and their particular necklaces came from his tribe. And so he knew that they belonged before they even said a word.
Here's where we want to talk a little bit about the offshore islands of Haida Gwaii. You saw them in the big chart. They're offshore of northern British Columbia. Few mariners actually cross here because it's a challenging 80 nautical mile run with notoriously unpredictable sea conditions across the Hecate Strait. These islands are the seat of the Haida people, and before contact, they were the Vikings of the Pacific Northwest, raiders and slavers terrifying all the coastal peoples. The Haida just this year regained complete authority over their islands, and on Haida Gwaii there remain many ancient small villages, each manned by a watchman whose aim it is to protect and to preserve their heritage as well as to share their tribal narrative. On this totem pole here, you can see the watchmen that are carved into the top with the red hats. They are looking around in every direction and symbolizing the great ancient culture they had on Haida Gwaii.
The highlight for many people on Haida Gwaii is the village of Sigangawai. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site on the southernmost tip of the southern island of Guayhanas. It's truly an evocative, magical, ancient place, collaboratively managed between Parks Canada and the Haida Nation. And the Haida, like many of the other First Nations, believe that everything should return to the earth in its time. So these totem poles that you can see here disintegrating are not preserved and will not be preserved. They'll be allowed to fall to the earth in due course, and they'll be subsumed by the earth. So my recommendation to you is that if you would like any little piece of this action, if you want to see this place in person, go soon. The Haida people were so powerful in part because they had the largest trees in their cedar and spruce forests on pre-glacial land. A single red cedar could be made into a canoe large enough to hold 60 warriors in a raiding party. They were great explorers and slavers, retreating to the safety of their islands after raids where few others dared to follow to exact retribution. We were hiking in the forest here when we came across this moss-covered canoe. It was carved in place and never finished for reasons that we don't know. But these canoes were always carved in place when a suitable tree was found in order to make them lighter to carry down to the water.
It can be lonely out there in the great wilderness. Very sad. We always seem to be at the right place at the wrong time, or at the wrong place at the wrong time. But we are alone there together, and we get along well. And we may not see another boat for many days. So we must be able to coexist in a small space in a challenging environment. In contrast, we occasionally enjoy having friends aboard. It can be complicated to find us, so to depart and arrive at Jupiter, we often use float planes because it is difficult to predict where Jupiter might be. So much is wind and weather dependent.
Also combating loneliness are our fellow travelers. The people and the creatures that we meet along the way are almost by definition fascinating because they're there. I'd like to tell you about this wild pig. Came out of the bush when we were hiking near Back Eddy in British Columbia and took an instant liking to Randy. He walked with us for a little way, and when his little short legs could no longer keep up, he turned back and we carried on. And we returned this way many hours later, and the pig was waiting for his new best friend.
His name is Winston, and I loved him.
Some other characters with whom we have interacted. This is a team of Canadian influencers that we were very surprised to find in McMicking Inlet on the backside of Campania Island. It's a very remote spot. They were shooting video for Sitka Gear Clothing, and they were the real deal. Hunter-gatherers and a photographer of endurance sports, and the fellow in the back is a renowned fire chef. They hailed us over to their sailboat when we came into the bay and offered us a side of fresh-caught salmon. We reciprocated by inviting them for drinks aboard Jupiter. They were very excited to accept. And when they came, they brought these two enormous Dungeness crabs, which are actually muscled into my big igloo cooler, and they barely fit. And then they proceeded to drink all the wine on Jupiter.
This is a Dahl's porpoise, another fellow traveler, sometimes confused with orcas because of the black and white coloring. If they see or hear our boat, a pod will immediately rush to the boat and surf the bow wave for several miles. They are muscled, athletic, and they are show-offs who actually make eye contact. If one of us is up at the bow taking photos or observing them, they will stay with us. But as soon as we leave, they will shove off. Tom, the long-distance kayaker, we first met at the Namu Cannery, which you saw. He was paddling from Olympia, Washington to Haines, Alaska, which would be a trip of about 1,500 nautical miles. He is not alone, and we have met endurance kayakers in various places. They are a tough breed. They ask nothing of us, even if we offer. Occasionally, we engage with orcas. In this instance, a pod of about 20 approached Jupiter on the Pacific coast of Dahl Island in Alaska, and they appeared to be either warning their young about the boat or showing off their young to us. We haven't really figured it out. But they were extremely interactive, and like the Dahl's porpoise, they seemed to want to somehow communicate. We never, ever approach whales or porpoise, but they often approach us.
These two prom goers were initially reluctant to make eye contact, but they were having their prom photos taken on the dock near Jupiter, and we invited them to come aboard and take pictures in the bow. They were thrilled. Prince Rupert is the northernmost port in British Columbia, and interestingly, the shortest straight line distance on the Great Circle route to Asia. So there's a lot of big commercial shipping that goes in and out of here. This young lady was from the town of Prince Rupert, and her prom date was from the nearby native village of Metlakatla. And then local residents. The fellow on the left is of Tlingit descent, and he was a veteran and a code breaker during World War II. The Tlingit used their language to pass indecipherable messages on behalf of the United States. The very jolly couple on the right showed us local secret access to the infamous Totem Bar in Wrangell, Alaska. Here they served the best Bloody Marys that I never got to taste, and here's why. I was very busy interviewing them for our blog. Randy was holding the drinks, and he drank first his and then mine.
It was an accident. Here we see humpbacks almost daily in British Columbia and Alaska, usually spotting their spout first. The shape of their blow is unique to each whale species, and we occasionally at night hear their song through Jupiter's hull. We are seeing very healthy, large populations of these immense, sometimes airborne whales. Fiona, of course, is always looking for attractive men, but particularly Alaskan men. Here are a couple of residents from Port Protection. They're rusticators and survivalists. They're outcasts, perhaps runaways who have found each other. On the left, we have Mike, the tree faller, featured in one of the National Geographic episodes. And Bill, on the right, he slept through the filming, but his story is worth an entire Explorers Club meeting.
We divert for sea lions. In this area, we have Steller and California sea lions, and the Steller are the larger and more aggressive, but any of them can be quite aggressive. These are probably the most dangerous creature that we interact with. They're very curious, and they'll come right up to the boat, as you can see here, but if we're out in our tender, they'll happily be circling the tender for a while, and everything is all cool and kosher, but then suddenly something flips, and one of the males will decide that that's enough, and they will turn and run us off with teeth bared, growling, in full attack mode. We get the message. These creatures live in massive haulouts or rookeries, hundreds strong, on remote windswept sea-splashed rocks, and you can usually smell and hear them long before you can see them. The males are very protective of their harems.
When traveling, particularly in Southeast Alaska, we are cruising with the fishing fleet, often berthing alongside them in a port or in an anchorage. These fishermen work very hard, and they are very friendly and as curious about us as we are of them. Here is Petersburg, Alaska. It's a very famous, historically Norwegian enclave with a wealthy fishing fleet of big boats, and it has its own factories, fish factories and canneries, so they're vertically integrated in Petersburg. Many of the fishing vessels are old wooden craft preserved through generations of fishing families. One vessel can be re-rigged during the season to catch several different types of fish. Molly Maid is currently rigged for seining. Here is Craig, Alaska. It's a rough town with rough docks, a small post office, and a cafe right out of the 1950s. It is the site of Alaska's worst unsolved mass murder. I highly recommend reading the book, What Happened in Craig, because having visited here twice, it is easy to believe that such a mysterious and heinous crime was perpetrated in this harbor.
Spending months at sea as we do, it is important that we eat well aboard. Vitus Bering and all his crew, for all his care, died of scurvy. We try to provision as locally as possible, and that is not always easy. Most of the fresh produce is brought up by barge from Seattle, and as Randy likes to say, is seasick by the time it gets there. We're often gifted fresh catch, or we catch our own. There's such an abundance of seafood that sharing the bounty is considered a neighborly habit. We grow our own microgreens in the onboard farm, as we call it, and we try to cook meals that are inspired by the ingredients that we have to hand. Of the 5 species of salmon in Alaska, king is preferred on Jupiter. There are many ways to prepare it. Of course, we have our favorites. We eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner aboard for weeks at a time. There are very few restaurants ashore, even in towns, once we're north of Vancouver Island. And one of the great pastimes on Jupiter is to catch our own crabs, or try to catch our own crabs in a trap. We buy licenses to be able to do this, and we set the trap out at about 5 o'clock in the evening and pick it up before breakfast in the morning, hopefully full of a great haul of Dungeness crab, which makes an absolutely delicious meal.
Occasionally you catch something you don't fish for. In this case, jellyfish. This large lion's mane was sucked into Jupiter's generator saltwater cooling system, and the generator overheated and shut down. It was a difficult and dangerous task to clean out, and it was disgusting to try to clean out the sea strainer. You can see here on the stern, this gross creature ruined our day. Life aboard is quite comfortable, and Starlink has changed our life in many good and some bad ways. We have powerful internet similar to what we have at home, but we have lost the ability to be truly off the grid. We read a lot, do repairs, study charts, plan routes, and we sleep well.
We don't always know where we're going, but we do know where we have been, and so can you. We carry
a Garmin InReach tracker, which is I'm carrying right here, and every explorer should have one of these because you can push the SOS button and somebody will find you. It's a wonderful thing, and we have a permanent record of all 7 years of our tracks. As shown here, this is a small portion, but you can get a lot of detail, and we can go back and reference this. Where were we at such and such a time?
We write and photograph for our blog and for various magazines and for the Coast Guard Auxiliary. We believe that it makes us more astute observers of the world that we are lucky enough to find ourselves in, and we really enjoy the process. We love having those of you who follow the blog aboard. In many ways, you are our company for the summer. And for those of you who are not already following, this is your invitation to sign up, and you can leave us at any time.
My brother Woodson had a motto aboard his tall ship Lynx that we have adopted aboard Jupiter, and that is, be kind to each other and to your ship.
Thank you so much for listening. If anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And we'll be here for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
We do.